Almost 401 here, so I will get us going. But before I begin, I want to throw it over to the Ego folks. Do you have any announcements or anything that you want to uh, say to the assembled before we begin this panel?
I would just say if you have any questions at any point, if you don't want to keep them in your head, feel free to just throw those into the chat directly to Dr. Thompson, and he will have those accessible. And Dr. Thompson, if you want to, or I can do as well, spotlight the speakers as they're going, that'd be great.
Okay, great. Yeah, if I know how to do that, I will. Tell me, since I know we're already recording, how to spotlight. I usually have to have things in gallery, and I hide my self view usually so that I don't have to look at myself.
I can do it for you. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Oh, you're a co-host?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I did not know. Okay, wonderful. Yes. So I will leave that up to you. That will be your responsibility, and I will field the chat questions um, and collate those as well. So okay, let us begin. Welcome and thanks for coming to the Friday afternoon panel. Um, Giving a voice to the marginalized. We will go in order of the program, and I will introduce the speakers one at a time, but before their papers, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. As Kimberly just said, if you have a question and you want to sort of get it in the queue, go ahead and throw that in the chat, not to everyone, but just directly to me. And I will go through those questions. Or you're also welcome during the Q&A session to sort of unmute and ask as well. So questions, comments, connections that you see, all of that is welcome. Okay, our first paper is by Daniel Hellman. Dan is currently a third-year doctoral student in the Literature and Criticism program, focusing on contemporary fiction. He's also interested in creative writing, as you may have seen in the last panel, and streams video games on Twitch in his free time. Free time, grad students don't have free time. Dan's paper is entitled Extinction as Rebirth, the Adversarial Evolution of Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited. So give him a sort of visual applause and make him feel welcome. Thank you very much, Daniel.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. And as far as free time goes, I just kind of make it up as I go, like everything else. All right, so as was noted, my paper is titled Extinction as Rebirth, the Adversarial Evolution of Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited. Rebirth presents itself as a trans-religious and trans-cultural concept that comes in forms such as biblical resurrection or personal rebranding. Extinction would prove to be counter to that, as it is the ending of the living existence of a species, idea, or institution. As for its influence on literature, the latter can be traced back to deterministic thought in the Victorian era. A thread of influence in Victorian literature has been the reading of science on major period writers such as the Bronte sisters and George Eliot. Geologic thought that includes the writings of Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin shaped the thinking behind these works through their understanding and presentation of deep time from biological and geological perspectives, and the concepts of the fossil record and excavating layers impact the narrative structure of these works to suggest a more thorough and deterministic outlook on the world. Much like the layer of the geologic strata, a novel that subscribes to deep time respects the layers it forms or is examining. Though useful for discussion of Victorian literature based on Gillian Beer's article, Darwin and the Uses of Extinction, the question I seek to answer regards moving forward in time rather than looking back. Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited is a World War II set novel that follows Charles Ryder as he stumbles upon the Brideshead estate he was once familiar with and explores his flashbacks of his life in the 1920s prior to the war. In those flashbacks, Charles meets Sebastian Flight, the son of aristocracy, and becomes enamored with Sebastian and his way of life, to the extent that the relationship is viewed from a queer standpoint. He also meets Anthony Blanche, an open homosexual whom he is not particularly fond of, though no real reasoning is given. Brideshead Revisited follows the memories of Charles as he becomes closer to the Flights, as well as his eventual downward spiral following Sebastian's own downfall. The novel is noted for its discussion of Catholic theology, as well as its queer undertones in the relationship between Charles and Sebastian. However, it is also noteworthy for both fitting a deep time model and challenging the notions of that same model. Instead, Wall uses narrative markers in the form of Sebastian Anthony, the guide Charles Ryder through his evolutionary course and rebirth in defiance of potential extinction. My paper discusses the idea that the memories of Sebastian and Anthony, as well as their journeys, serve as a guide for Charles in his attempt to reconnect with Brideshead Manor. I also consider the concept of extinction as it relates to Charles's queer developments. I choose these three characters to discuss sorry, I can't even talk today. To also incorporate a conversation regarding queer celibacies from Martin B. Lockard in his essay, Decadent Arcadia, Sexuality, Conversions, and Queer Celibacies in Brideshead Revisited. Both Beer and Lockard together, as well as Lyellian thinking, demonstrates Brideshead Revisited as a novel of deep time that presents its three queer characters in layers. First, I will discuss Lyell's role in the narrative of Deep Time. Published in the 1830s, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology served as a scientific examination of geologic study by looking at fossils, rock layers, and other features that are mainstays of physical geology today. For Deep Time, Lyell makes the point in his section, Theoretical Errors which have retarded the progress of geology, that a fallacy exists as far as assuming that the creation events such as man-made superstructures and mountain chains were both subject to ultra-fast construction as opposed to more labored practice and pacing. Lyell effectively makes a greater discussion on correcting the time frame that was prevalent in geology prior to his study accounting for new discoveries. On a literary standpoint, Lyell's points suggest that events in literature aren't necessarily monumental level superhuman feats, but parts of a whole event or layer. We should also assume that our inaccurate understanding of past events gives way for misunderstandings of related events by association. Brideshead Revisited is no exception to the way time is presented, with Brideshead not being abandoned in a day, but over time. Another point of Lyell that fits this narrative is found in his chapter, Progressive Development of Life. Here, Lyell states, begin quote, the uniformity of the plan being once assumed, events which have occurred at the most distant periods in the animate and inanimate world will be acknowledged to throw light on each other, end quote. In essence, Lyell is discussing that storied evolution and metamorphosis of the record helped to provide a better understanding of these developments, which in turn influence the development of human understanding of their world reflected in their work and thinking. This quote, in particular, emphasizes the importance of crossing between living and non-living records that determine that history. In that, researchers are able to more readily understand these developments and to build a more accurate depiction beyond the veil of calamity that had been present in history prior. The other major scientific breakthrough of that era was through Charles Darwin, which Jillian Beer writes about in her aforementioned article. She discusses Darwin's uses of extinction and states his courageous refusal of the comforts of what he cannot fully believe in, the immortality of the human soul, includes the stark recognition that total annihilation of the person follows individual death, end quote. Both Darwin and Lyell push against the idea of divine intervention in favor of more controlled and layered views of time progression based upon visible evidence. These views become important in studying Brideshead, as it is a novel that progresses forward and backward through time to present each layer and how it cemented itself in Charles's memory. This point, along with Lyell, emphasizes the push against intervention and instead allows for the understanding of geologic phenomena as a series of events over time rather than events in time. Beer also discusses Darwin's view on extinction, stating that his view is that it decries the exasperated response to the event that has otherwise been happening as is. She makes a useful observation regarding Darwin and his stance on others' viewing of extinction. Darwin takes exception to those who attempt to downplay extinction rather than examining the event for what it is. Brideshead proves to fit in with this explanation, as it is once a vibrant manner before becoming abandoned and subject to the whims of the British Army. And each player involved becomes part of the extinction cycle of the manor. However, my focus is on the queer characters of this novel. Lyell and Beer's discussion of Darwin give us a framework to discuss deep time methods, which are found in Locker's discussion of queer celibacies in his aforementioned piece. Locker likens the development of Charles's queerness and ideology as the development of a fine wine, which is a process steeped in deep time for its reliance on waiting as well as the means of creating the mash to be fermented in the first place. Locker makes that analogy in this passage, and this will be a block quote, and I'll end it when it's appropriate. Similarly, homosexual experimentation temporarily prevents the young lover from reaching maturity. Until the brandy and wine have aged together in darkness for years and grown into a single entity, the spirit of queer love makes the lover unsuitable for the table, an unmistakable metaphor for the altar. What results is not simply delayed heteronormative love, quite the opposite. The young man who goes through the process comes out the other end as a sweeter, more intoxicating drink than simple table wine. He is sexually transubstantiated into a being that dissolves the simple gay straight binary in the process of maturation. End quote. And this statement lends itself back to Lyle and Beer's discussion of deep time when looking at Charles's engagement in the queer as a layer upon his own life through his memories. His maturity becomes questioned in his development and infatuation for Julia, who is Sebastian's sister, who puts him in mind of Sebastian, but also serves as his link to Brideshead. At least until the catastrophic event that is Lord Marchmain's Sebastian Julia's father, sudden return to faith on his deathbed. Putting these three perspectives together, we're left to consider queerness as another layer in Charles's memory, with Anthony and Sebastian being its fossil markers, one of whom is better preserved than the other in the grand scheme of Charles's recollection. Where this becomes useful is considering the comment made by Lyle in his Theoretical Errors chapter, where he pushes back against divine intervention as well as Darwin's view on grander power. Though Charles is certainly influenced by Catholic belief from Sebastian and his family, he isn't driven to it catastrophically, but molded by it slowly. This is relevant considering Sebastian's clear effect on Charles's memory to influence his love for Julia. However, I would start with Anthony Blanche and his efforts on Charles' developments first. Anthony Blanche effectively becomes a marker of resistance for Ryder because of his flamboyancy, a trait which is off-putting to his compatriots. Charles shows his distaste for Anthony when they go out together, as Charles himself points out. All the term, I had been seeing rather more of Anthony Blanche than my liking for him warranted. Our frequent meetings were more of his choosing than mine, for I held him in considerable awe. End quote. On the same page, Charles flashes back to Anthony's past, describing the attempts to make an Englishman out of him. In their time spent together, Anthony becomes a confessional figure as he shares his knowledge on Sebastian, as well as attempts to exert a bit of control of Charles. You see, Charles, I understand all your tastes. End quote on that. Anthony says as he's picking out a wine while also suggesting a trip to France, either playfully or seriously. Anthony's main move, however, is to share all he knows of the Lord Marchmain and his family, while also providing insight on Charles's and Sebastian's relationship. He says, so you see, we mustn't blame Sebastian if at times he seems a little insipid, but then you don't blame him, do you, Charles? End quote. Anthony is effectively Charles's initial marker for his relationship with Sebastian. However, we see Darwin win out as Anthony's pushed out of the habitat. Anthony doesn't last in this narrative and leaves rather unremarkably, with his departure being reduced to pursuing a policeman in Munich. The mood is somber, but moves to different pieces. However, we're given a glimpse of Anthony's impact on 121 within the novel, when Charles, as narrator, comments, Anthony Blanche had taken something away with him when he went. He had locked a door and hung the key on his chain, and all his friends, among whom he had always been a stranger, needed him now. End quote. Charles shows the kind of impact a stranger had upon their lives, even in his distaste. Anthony effectively becomes fossilized at this point, having not survived in the context of the narrative, though he's not necessarily extinct, as he reappears later in the novel. He becomes part of the record of Charles's memory and influence on his queering. However, despite Anthony being the obvious choice of queerness to discuss in this novel, we need to consider Sebastian and his relationship with Charles as what predicates this layer to form in Charles's mind. Sebastian is quite simply a remarkable character in his own right, and Charles shows an infatuation for him early on, enough so that Anthony Blanche felt need to step in and attempt to influence him. As narrator, Charles says of Sebastian, I knew Sebastian by sight long before I met him. That was unavoidable, for from his first week, he was the most conspicuous man of his year by reason of his beauty, which was arresting, and his eccentricities of behavior, which seemed to know no bounds. End quote. Sebastian becomes a powerful influence for Charles through his development, becoming a clear part of his narrative and layer. However, Sebastian's impact comes through with influencing Charles's view of Julia, Sebastian's sister, but first to deal with Sebastian's eventual downfall. Sebastian, however, also proves to suffer a similar fate to Anthony, but sticks more readily in memory. In subsequent chapters, it is revealed that Sebastian falls on hard times and resorts to a nomadic lifestyle with intermittent bouts of alcoholism. Gordeliev gives insight as to what's become of Sebastian, who ends up going to Morocco, a place of happiness for him. This is the point where it's considered that Sebastian is effectively no more given his illness and propensity to drink. However, he is effectively gone from Charles's psyche as his own person and is instead manifested in Charles's views of Julia. Where Sebastian is the fossil, Julia is the layer that forms and pushes Charles further along. Though Sebastian's body is no longer present, his influence still lives on in Julia. As a result of Sebastian's disappearance from Charles's life, Julia effectively becomes the Sebastian-like lover interest for him. Charles provides a quick reflection on Julia's presence by saying, "It is time to speak of Julia, who till now has played an intermittent and somewhat enigmatic part in Sebastian's drama. It was thus she appeared to me at the time, and I to her." End quote. Charles effectively becomes enamored with Julia in Sebastian's absence and eventual transfers of Brideshead. Where Sebastian is a fossil for Charles, Julia is the layer that suspends the fossil. On that note, Charles remarks, "I had not forgotten Sebastian. He was with me daily in Julia, or rather, it was Julia I had known in him, in those distant Arcadian days." End quote. Julia effectively picks up where Sebastian had left off for Charles as they plot to divorce their spouses to marry each other. However, this doesn't end well as Julia decides against entering a sinful marriage. Ultimately, the two fall out with Charles's final line before the epilogue being a reflective remark. Charles, as the narrator says, "The avalanche was down, the hillside swept bare behind it, the last echoes died on the white slopes, the new mount glittered and lay still in the silent valley." End quote. Charles's invocation of geologic formation shows his moving on from the layer that was the flights, with Julia becoming a fossil in her own layer. Seeing Brideshead again uncovers those layers of fossils, much like an excavation. What proves to be interesting about the queer figures of Brideshead and their fates is, though Anthony Blanche does return to the narrative later on, his expulsion from it earlier suggests a treatment of the queerness of this novel. Sebastian's fate as well lends to the credence that Charles's queerness is to be a layer on his development. It doesn't necessarily become extinct, but goes on the wayside. Even Julia isn't immune, as she is effectively a harbinger of Sebastian for Charles, who ultimately decides to break off the relationship, ending Charles's connection with Brideshead and the flights. This effectively becomes Brideshead Revisited's representation of queer celibacy that Lockhart has argued in his article, while also forsaking those characters whom are deviant to the tenets of faith. The geological understanding of Brideshead Revisited shows that the influence of Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin impacts literature outside of the Victorian era. Both these figures serve as relics of their own time, marking the geologic layer that is their era of literature. Each piece of literature becomes a fossil in its own right, or a marker of the era. By exploring deep time constructs, Waugh is able to suspend his characters in motion as they continue to build upon their existences and impact the strata they leave behind, even if that stratum happens to be a queer one. Much like the wine example of Lockhart, rocks are formed from a variety of sources and may very well become potent from metamorphosis, much like the ashes of Sebastian manifested into Julia for Charles in the end. And I will leave it there and move on to the next person.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Give him a hand, be it vocal or virtual. Thank you again, Daniel. Our next presenter is Thomas Hamilton. Thomas D. Hamilton Jr. Is in IUP's MA in English Composition and Literature program with an expected graduation date of summer 2021. Thomas is an Indiana PEA resident and has been for several years. He tutors at the Writing Center. Although Thomas's entire MA experience has been online, including currently in my class, the instructors and fellow students have provided a vibrant learning environment. Following graduation, Thomas intends to teach at the community college level in person and online. This is Thomas's first conference presentation, so make sure to make Thomas feel quite welcome in that sense. Thomas's paper is titled Grief Observed in Jhumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter, The Impact of Stillbirth Death on Parents' Identities and Relationships in Fiction. And if we get the spotlight on Thomas here, there we go. All right.
So that's the spotlight. Okay.
Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you. And thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with the conference. It's been a great experience with IUP, and this is not total sycophantic. It's just been a great experience. So I'm thankful for this opportunity today as well. Do I have the ability to share screen to pull up some slides? Looks like.
Kimberly is nodding yes. So
Okay,
if
good.
you're a co-host, you can. Yeah.
Okay, great. My paper this afternoon is research on how fiction portrays trauma and grief in relationships. And as I read the call for papers for this conference, Phoenix Responses to Adversity, it seemed that Jhumpa Lahiri's short story, A Temporary Matter, would be worth considering, not just for content, but more for Lahiri's narrative structure to convey post-traumatic grief. So today's paper, just in the time given, will review a few of those elements. And so, is that working? We good? Okay. Thank you. So the title of my paper, The Grief Observed in Jhumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter, the Impact of Stillbirth Death on Parents' Identities and Relationships, and the Role of Fiction. Lahiri's A Temporary Matter, the opening story in her Pulitzer Prize-winning collection of short stories, Interpretive Maladies, delves into the grief of parents of a stillborn child. Because little representation of stillbirth death and its impact exist in fiction, Lahiri opens a window to parents' trauma and grief of a common pregnancy occurrence in order to consider how a traumatic event, as their child's death, can change or transform a person's identity and relationships. Lahiri uses the short story format, disjointed narrative structure, third-person limited narrator, as well as the use of non-sequential time, place, and things to detail how their child's death affects their identities and marriage. Everything is viewed as temporary, as noted in the story's title, even that which seemed previously, such as their marriage and careers. Grief has isolated them from family, friends, and each other. Shame and silence permeate their relationship. Lahiri demonstrates that fiction immerses readers into and through traumatic events that nonfiction and even reality are not equipped to fully convey. In A Temporary Matter, Lahiri introduces an Indian American couple, Shukumar and Shobha, and their marriage before and after the stillbirth, to highlight the stark contrast that the death has wrought on the relationship. The story unfolds over the course of 5 days in March, when they're notified their house will be without electricity in the evenings due to a temporary construction project in their Boston, Massachusetts neighborhood. The darkness during the nightly outages creates a change in their isolated routines and opens them to being together and talking more intentionally. The candlelight dinners and conversations focus on things they never shared with each other previously and begin to restore an intimacy between them. On the last day, the power is restored and no candlelight dinner is needed. In the light, Shobha shares that she is going to get an apartment and move out, which devastates Shukumar. In response to this painful premeditated news, Shukumar then shares that he did see their stillborn child before it was taken away to be cremated. The quote says, Shobha had turned the lights off. She came back to the table and sat down, and after a moment, Shukumar joined her. They wept together for the things they now knew. End of quote. Their confessions break their estrangement. A brief textual analysis reveals how Lahiri captures the couple's grief process. Lahiri uses a short story format with non-sequential time and an unreliable narrator to underscore the rupture of an assumed linear chronological progression, not just of time, but of identity. Time, place, relationships, careers, interpersonal communication, Indian American ethnicity, and things which define the protagonist's identities are now in ashes due to the stillbirth of their child. Lahiri is an author of short stories and novels in English and Italian. The choice for this to be in a short story format emphasizes its temporariness. Lahiri writes, fleeting by nature, short stories, in spite of their concision and concentration, are infinitely elastic, expansive, probing, elusive, suggesting that the genre itself is essentially unstable, hybrid, even subversive in nature. Leary uses non-sequential time to disorient the reader. She briefly starts the story in the present moment after the death of their child, with Shobha and Shukumar being notified of the pending power outage. But through observations and recollections of Shukumar, the stillbirth isn't one part of a larger narrative arc. It is the story. Life has stopped and the child's death commands all attention. The narrative structure captures that time is no longer stable. This sequence emphasizes the grief they are experiencing is neither linear nor chronological in effect. Slides. This is not a story that's being retold to any possible future children or grandchildren as a form of remembrance, nor is it a story that looks ahead to the pregnancy and its unforeseen consequences. Lahiri keeps the protagonist squarely in the midst of the grief, the past that included future longings. He imagined himself gripping the wheel, the quote says, as Shobha turned around to hand the children juice boxes. It can't be avoided and keeps the present and its pain at the periphery until the end of the story. The unsteadiness of time demonstrates the instability of grief. The narrative point of view of the story is limited third person, focusing more on Shukumar and his interior world than on Shobha. Given the grief both protagonists experience, Shukumar could be considered an unreliable narrator. Silence and isolation grip both characters, which limits a more holistic shared perspective of the stillbirth grief. They weren't like this before, the quote says. Now he had to struggle to say something that interested her, something that made her look up from her plate or from her proofreading files. Eventually, he gave up trying to amuse her. He learned to not mind the silences. Lahiri uses Shukumar to watch grief rather than acknowledge or experience it himself. Lahiri could have chosen to use Shobha's viewpoint, but keeps the reader at a distance. It is a grief observed. Shobha, as the mother, had an immersive traumatic experience in her entire being. Lahiri implies that Shobha's story, that experience, is a grief beyond words. To enter into Shobha's interior world would either be too much to encounter or too disorienting, since Shobha had yet to fully process her loss. Linguistic scholar William Labov writes of trauma, the emotions associated with the death of a close family member challenge the linguistic capacity of the speaker and the capacity of language itself. In the ceremonies that form the social response to such a sudden death, it's frequently acknowledged that linguistic means are inadequate to report the emotions of the speaker. Shukumar guides the story through his interior unstable emotions and witnessing Shobha's exterior behaviors. Shukumar and Shobha have both isolated as a self-protective measure. To face each other is to encounter the loss that they aren't ready to personally experience or share. Lahiri employs a plot device of a progression of confessed secrets each night during the power outages to build to a climactic finish. Their normal silent routine has been disrupted. And with each night, there is now an anticipation between the couple of what will be shared. The quote says, something happened when the house was dark. They were able to talk to each other again. The secrets were related to the other's identity. Previously, they either didn't consider them important to share or didn't want to disrupt their seemingly healthy relationship. The secrets sequence charts their relationship. First date, family and career matters, finally more intimate truths. Shobha says she didn't like Shukumar's only poem because it was too sentimental. Shukumar shared that he ripped out and kept a magazine advertisement with a woman's body in the later part of Shobha's pregnancy after she became less attractive to him during that time. Expressions of creation and intimacy were rejected by the other. The shared secrets, however, do not further alienate them, but rather draw them closer, including that they make love on the fourth night. Lahiri creates an expectation now with this plot device that by the end of the construction project, their marriage will be restored. The fifth and final dinner scene, however, ruptures the newly established routine and expectation. This was not the anticipated intimate sharing as during the previous nights. Once again, grief disrupts their time and emotional progression. Shobha breaks their silence in the dark by turning on the lights and notifying Shukumar that she's moving out. She echoes the doctor's words she heard at the hospital that it wasn't anything Shukumar could have done. In turn, Shukumar breaks the silence of their child's death. The quote is, he had held him until a nurse knocked and took him away, and he promised himself that day that he would never tell Shobha because he still loved her then, and it was the one thing in her life that she had wanted to be a surprise. End quote. The 6 months of avoiding their emotions and each other are broken open. Their child is now mentioned aloud. Throughout the story, Lahiri keeps the delivery and the stillbirth baby at the periphery. There is minimal communication about the baby itself. Their child is not named. Shobha doesn't see the child. There's no mention of a funeral. The story recalls that the doctor appears briefly to inform them that Shobha's placenta weakened. There wasn't anything that could have been done to save the baby, and they should be able to have children in the future without any problem. This is where Lahiri especially captures the sterility and impotence in the reactions to stillbirth. Shobha and Shukumar have spent months preparing for the birth of their child, including future hopes and plans. The doctor dismisses the loss in a few words and a professional smile, tells them to keep trying, and leaves the couple on their own to figure out their tragic loss. They must return barren to a house, family, and friends ready for a baby. No other work of Lahiri has at the center of the story a family experiencing stillbirth. Angela Monaco writes about Lahiri's work, by focusing on everyday life and traumatic memories, Lahiri makes literature a privileged site for addressing neurosis and the search of care and solidarity, end quote. By starting the collection, Interpretive Maladies, with the most jarring story of a temporary matter, Lahiri provokes the reader to consider his or her own existence and identity. If career, parenting, marriage are the pinnacles of society and success, Lahiri shows what happens when they're taken away. The most unfathomable loss, the death of a child, prods parents to consider whether their bonds are strong enough to continue on once their hopes are buried. Lahiri provides a window into their grief to allow readers that have experienced the same or similar trauma a place to reflect, grieve, and move on. The story ends with them coming together in the full knowledge of their loss. It does not state that their marriage survives. It doesn't state whether they have other children. Lahiri continues to keep them in their grief, but now with a way through it. During the story, their grief was unspoken and isolated. With their confessions in the dark and the light, they now weep and share their grief together for the things they now knew. In conclusion, Lahiri's narrative structure, including the use of non-sequential time, an unreliable narrator, a plot device to create but disrupt expectations, and minimal communication about the baby, disorient readers into a world of grief in order to guide them through it. Fiction immerses readers in situations that self-help and medical resources can't touch, and that real life often fears to express. Lahiri also proclaims with the first of her short story collection, A Temporary Matter, that fiction is the true interpreter of maladies. We're excited. And
Thank you very much, Thomas.
thank you very much.
Appreciate it. I'll give it a second to change the share here. Good. Now we move on to our third presenter, Joshua Calandrella. Joshua Patrick Calandrella is a second-year student in the MA Literature program at IUP. His academic interests include translation studies, Latin American novels, representations of religious mysticism in literature, and modern Yiddish poetry. As a polyglot in training, Joshua also studies Hebrew, Arabic, Japanese, and Thai. Joshua's paper is titled Surrealist Yeshivas, Yiddish Tabernacles, Places of Imaginative Restoration. So give a nice warm welcome to Joshua.
Hi, everybody. I have a virtual handout that has copies of the different poems that I'll be reading from. I sent it in the chat, so if that, can everybody access that?
Dr. Thompson, you'll want to share that to everybody.
The chat was just to me in a direct message.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's right. I will share it to everyone.
Okay, excellent.
Go ahead.
Okay, so in this presentation, I would like to think poetically about Jewish poetry. I'll be using a framing metaphor that will offer us an opportunity to consider how certain Jewish poets use their poetry to respond to adversity. To think of Jewish poetry as if it were a Yiddish tabernacle or a surrealist yeshiva directs our attention to the co-creative relationship shared between the poet, the reader, and the words of the poem itself. I created this metaphor based off of the interactive and the mobile features of the biblical tabernacle, which is sort of a tent sanctuary and a place of gathering the Israelites met at during their wandering in the wilderness of Sinai. And the yeshiva is an educational institution from which I expand on the Havrusa model of learning, which just is an Aramaic word that means friendship or companionship. This is a method of learning that groups students together in pairs to discuss and debate their current studies. We will examine excerpts from classical and modern Hebrew poetry, as well as modern Yiddish poetry in recent English translations. Like the space of the tabernacle, the verses in the book of Psalms suggest that the psalmist would write with a certain power, if not a responsibility, to construct spaces where they may meet with their creator. In his recent book, The Great Shift, James Kugel considers the Psalms as a crucial but often overlooked text that is overshadowed by narrative portions of the Bible. Kugel considers the relationships between the creator and the created, as they might be understood through verses of prayer and supplications. He writes, these verses were indeed believed to make their way to God. In fact, it was the cry of the victim that in some sense made the world work, causing God to notice and take up the cause of justice and right. Behaving like the creator, whom in the beginning creates the world with words, so does the psalmist or the reciter or even the reader of the book of Psalms intervene with a creative language during their own times of adversity. The nameless psalmist interacts with God in a series of poetic affirmations of the divine's attributes. For example, in the following verses taken from Psalm 3, here I'll be reading the name of God as Adonai, meaning Lord. And the psalm says, "O Adonai, my foes are so many. Many are those who attack me. Many say of me, there's no deliverance for him through God. But you, O Adonai, are a shield about me, my glory, he who holds my head high. I cry aloud to Adonai, and he answers me from his holy mountain." The first person subject pronouns and object pronouns invite the reader to identify with the cry of the psalmist. Yet some psalms, like in Psalm 3, they're framed with an attribution to King David. The first verse, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. The framing of the psalm with an episode from King David's legendary story, it may be a recognizable allusion, one that could ground the reader in a familiar biblical episode. But here, the poem, as a tabernacle, it offers the reader with an interpretive tool through the structure of sorts that here we may meet within the interwoven legend of King David, or choose not to, and experience it with our own impressions of the verse, as if we were just listening to it for the first time. Thinking of Jewish poetry as a tabernacle also allows us to consider the migratory, transnational, and the multilingual influences behind modern Jewish poetry, which has often been written in Yiddish. Anna Margolin participated in a very active Yiddish literary scene in New York during the early part of the 20th century. Yiddish scholar and translator Benjamin Harshoff has remarked on how Yiddish would speak directly to people in their own rich and living language, contrary to the more academic and religious Hebrew or Aramaic, two Jewish languages that were often incomprehensible to the masses. While Yiddish poetry certainly created an avenue to integrate women's voices, to be part of two often male-dominated literary and academic circles, it is important to note that Margolin herself also read in Hebrew. She knew French, German, Polish, Russian, and English. It is here in this intersection of multiple literary traditions that Margolin's Yiddish poetry is able to negotiate her own battles with depression and other lifelong adversities. Margolin certainly does not demystify or irreducibly secularize religious metaphors and symbols. Rather, she makes use of religious tropes and allusions. However, in Margolin's poem, we will not be wandering through the deserts of Sinai or hiding out in the wilderness of Jerusalem, or we will be, Margolin will take us to her city. And so this is some lines from her poem, In the Streets. Here a word of terror, there one of regret. Here I cried out, there in sorrow I paused. You transformed the roads into Golgotha, and my blood runs in all the streets. Here I wept. The dank walls were out, the stern judgment at the weak and the lost, while many lords and ladies looked on, as the woman walked through the dusk in tears. The lines depict her terror and sorrow, and attach them to the locations of the surrounding streets. Margolin reaffirms that these places are sites of weeping and judgment and terror. However, New York is transformed into Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion, which, according to the gospel narratives, is located outside of the city of Jerusalem. The poem goes on, pleading, raging, regretting. Now that last note of life blares forth, sinking into the dust. And yet, O God, O tormentor, I do believe. With dying fingers, I will yet touch a star, and I will hear an eternally profound and infinitely tender word. Margolin signifies her relationship with the Creator in Yiddish, O Gott, not a divine name in Hebrew, but the common German word Gott, and O Peiniger, O tormentor, not one of God's more forgiving or redemptive attributes, but even in the address, the poem is still a place for communication. And through this creative interaction, In the Street lingers with somewhat of a cosmic and gritty tenderness of reaching out for intimacy. I would like to also consider the co-creative qualities in Jewish poetry, but I would like for us to shift our poetic thinking a bit and to now consider Jewish poetry as if it were a surrealist yeshiva. Yeshiva derives from the Hebrew word meaning to sit, and it refers to both the institutionalized places of learning, and it also refers to the learning sessions themselves. It is here that I would like to think about the yeshiva as a surrealist experience in poetry, abstracted into moments of educational proximity with the poet, to be near the poet in a place of suffering. Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, after all, is the reception of mystical tradition and experiences through a direct experience with the everyday, which happens to be imbued with the supernatural. Zelda Mishkovsky, she weaves together in her poetry this mystical world with the domestic of the everyday. Her poetry invites all readers into her Hasidic imagination and to cross the barriers that would prevent anybody that might want to sit next to her and learn from her as a sort of mystical life teacher. While that seems to be the most insurmountable barrier that could prevent somebody from learning with the living, in Zelda's poem Be Not Far, she expresses how she can learn herself while being near the dead. Her poem reads, the consolers come to the outer courtyard and stand by the gate that faces the valley of the shadow of death, with its terror all around. Standing by the gate is all they can bear to do. My soul, too, is miles from the eye of the weeper, inevitably. This moment of grief surrounding the death of her husband transforms the subject, the I of the poem. The speaker becomes transcendent, even though she's still alive, albeit in the presence of a lifeless in the presence of a lifeless body and the distant soul of the dead. Additionally, Zelda addresses God in this moment of mourning. O creator of nights and wind, this terrible weeping is aimed at you. Be not far away. Let not millions of light years stand like a barrier between you and Job. Like in Psalm 3 and in Margolins in the Streets, Zelda addresses God in her moment of adversity with an affirmation of the divine attributes. In Hebrew, it's Yozer Leilot Baruch, the the creator of nights and the creator of the winds. The creator of the nights and the creator of the winds is the same creator of the day and the same creator of the living soul, even after it has been removed from the body. To be here now with Zelda is to be here for a moment with her, to think like her, to be like her, and contemplate this suspended moment of grief with her. So far, I've read to you from poems in which the speaker addresses their times of adversity and they turn to God, who's present but often distant. In this final poem by Avram Sutzkever, we will look at how the Surrealist yeshiva might appropriate the place of learning by addressing not God, but by addressing the dead themselves. In his poem Yiddish Street, Sutzkever revisits the living and dead after the destruction of the Holocaust. He visits the non-beings, the Jews who once lived in the now ruined Yiddish Street. Sutzkever affirms the attributes of the dead as if they were still living. And in this is the first stanza from the poem. You are not gone. Your emptiness is full of people with eyes like my mother's. Somewhere about flutters a page, a shul. Nobody has power over these flames. I could have sworn by your celestial border, deep in what has been and what will be, your people. Here's the old man hovering over the blue shas. Here's the holy village shop drinking chvas, Yiddish Street. While reading Yiddish Street, Sutzkever speaks through me as if we both trace the shadows of the lives of the living dead. As I am a reader, I too am like his student, one who has had to learn about what Sutzkever sees in this full but empty ruins. Even more, while translating this poem, Yiddish Street, I've become a co-creator with the poet, a co-creator with the non-beings, the empty but full echoes of the dead. So in conclusion, our final poet that we'll be looking at is me, as I am in dialogue with the dead in Sutzkever's poem, and the dead poets themselves that we've been talking about this afternoon as some kind of study companions and friends to their words. As a co-creator with the dead, I write as a Jewish poet and a translator. The Surrealist yeshiva of Jewish poetry propels the suspended moments of learning through time and space and across the divides of life and death and language. Like a Yiddish tabernacle, the means of this presentation and my reflections on these poems in translation is to bring these transformative moments of adversity back into the present moment. I'll leave you here with this. It's a third stanza from my translation of Yiddish Street. And I'd like you to remember that the speaker here is addressing the street itself. Just above your star curtain is reality. It is not reality, not a dream, not blindness. Pardon, I lost my page. It is not blindness. Here's the prophet with the stone gray hair, who paints the prophecy for naked children. Who could tolerate this weight of 500 years, deprived of opportunity? There are only a few paths now, in the smallest moment of the present. Who says it all has disappeared? What a mockery, what a lie. Somewhere a bass singer still booms a singing bass. The curtain of stars resounds as a symbol of transformation. It's a hyphenated word which combines stern, a Yiddish word, and paroche, a Hebrew word that means curtain. And this curtain signifies not only the separation of the Holy of Holies and in the Jewish temple and in the tabernacle, the space that divides both God and people, but is also the place where they both go to meet each other, behind and in front of the curtain. This word also refers to the decorative cloth that adorns the Torah in the synagogue. All of these places where Suskever would have seen this curtain in the Yiddish street are gone. However, Suskever lifts up the pillowcase, he lifts up the curtain and affirms it as a boundary of transcendental space, a place of making, a place of illuminating, and as a signifying image that connects the living to the dead, but still separates them from his presence. Spoken into existence, this curtain is woven into the firmament of stars, those distant but present reminders of the reality of the destruction of Yiddish street. It is through these poetic metaphors of the Yiddish tabernacle and the surrealist yeshiva that I've come to experience Yiddish poetry as a means for poetry readers and translators to share power with the poet in the creation of words that bring together the worlds of the unseen and the seen as they attempt to rectify the speech of the dead with the writing of the living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Wonderful work. We have one more speaker to go. And before I introduce Olivia, let me remind you, if you came in a couple minutes late, after this final paper on this panel, we will have a Q&A session. If you are thinking of questions and are worried you're going to forget, feel free to send those questions directly to me, Todd Thompson, on the chat. I am collecting those. Also, you will be able to unmute and to ask the questions via voice as well. But I want to give you that opportunity as well. Okay. Olivia Fayed is in her final year of the Masters of Arts in English program at IUP. Her interests include anything taboo, including but not limited to ghost stories, legends, myths, alchemy, nature, sexuality, sorcery, supernatural tales, etc. Olivia will be presenting on women's adversity in proclaiming their own right to sexuality through an analysis of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Olivia will be graduating this coming summer, congratulations, and will continue her academic career at IUP, pursuing a PhD in literature and criticism. Olivia's paper is entitled Women's Adversity in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and Sigmund Freud's Psychoanalytic Theory. Welcome, Olivia.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. Okay, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Excellent job to everybody. I loved listening to your works. It was great. So like Dr. Thompson said, my paper, Women's Adversity in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and Sigmund Freud's Psychoanalytic Theory. America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries remains a historical turning point for many great scholars and theorists, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sigmund Freud, though Freud was from Moravia and lived in America. However, Hawthorne breaks the conservative realm of literature with his classic novel, The Scarlet Letter. After his birth in 1856, Freud follows suit by developing one of the most controversial psychological theories to date, psychoanalytic and psychosexual theory. Although the timeline of Freud's theory and its influences come much later than the publication of Hawthorne's novel, there are clear parallels between the two. Psychoanalysts believe that behavior is a surface characteristic and it is the symbolic workings of the mind that must be analyzed in order to understand why a behavior occurs. Hawthorne suggests that liberation is the key to intellectual development and prosperity. In combining these two statements, the thesis here argues that the symbolic workings of the mind are responsible for eliciting a behavior that would conventionally be seen as taboo, but is in fact liberating for the perpetrators, specifically women overcoming adversity and embracing sexual liberation. Freud's psychoanalytic theory, psychosexual development theory, argues that, quote, development occurs in a series of stages focused on different pleasure areas of the body during each stage. One encounters conflicts that play a significant role in the course of development, end quote. This suggests that humans are naturally sexual beings, whether or not their society promotes or detests sexual liberation. Nature overtakes nurture, and sexual desire overrules conformity. The theory supports the idea that the subconscious has more control over behavior than anticipated by previous psychologists. Or simply, the mind craves the release of expressing subconscious desires, perhaps like sexual liberation, ultimately reaching satisfaction. Freud suggests that psychosexual desires control one's behaviors rather than society, law, or morals. Hawthorne evidently agrees with this argument as he tells the story of Hester Prynne's adulterous affair with the Puritan colony's Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale. Although Hester's estranged husband has been absent from the colony for 2 years, she becomes pregnant, a physical representation of her sin of adultery. It is not until later in the novel that the reader can determine that the father of Hester's child is in fact the Reverend Dimmesdale, the poster man of spiritual allegiance for the colony, but a sinner just like Hester. Hawthorne purposefully creates the story in order to represent the effect of psychosexuality on these two stereotypical characters, the harlot and the Reverend. Hester Prynne is the only beauty in the colony, where everyone else is dreary and dark. She emanates courage and light, even upon her departure from the prison with his baby on her arm. Hawthorne's depiction of Hester are quite full of praise. He almost elevates her to an angelic being rather than the sinner the colony single-mindedly sees her as because of her liberating expression of her own sexuality. Arthur Dimmesdale, on the other hand, is the Reverend, the man who is a spiritual beacon of divinity. The colony, each member desperate for their own pathway to God, is in awe of his every word. Yet Freud's theory rationalizes why an angelic woman and a Reverend would commit the sin of adultery. The mind subconsciously controls the body, and therefore, in the case of Hester and Dimmesdale, those actions of sexual desire and passion are merely acts of inborn human nature. Freud would suggest that the oppression of desire that Dimmesdale portrays is what causes his body to physically manifest his mental state over the course of the novel. As his guilt and lack of sexual liberation continue to consume his subconscious, he weakens. While Hester grows to become more able and courageous because she has accepted her sexual liberation. Simply because Dimmesdale is unwilling to liberate himself sexually and claim his sins, his mind begins to deteriorate his body, a death inside out. Freud believes that if sexual desire is subject to suppression, the conscious and subconscious begin to battle one another. This internal conflict is physically present in Dimmesdale and causes him to manifest as a hypochondriac, but actually this is a chemical reaction of the brain. By denying sexual liberation, Dimmesdale denies his natural passion for Hester and therefore subconscious desire. However, Dimmesdale's desire, results in the simultaneous deterioration of his mind and his body. Through this progressive physical decline of Reverend Dimmesdale, Hawthorne appears to agree with Freud's theory, supporting that the subconscious controls the mind and body, and that control is often led by sexual nature and desire for satisfaction. What is most notable here is that the woman is succeeding the man in the battle of sexual liberation, especially being in a time where that was seen as a horrific sin. However, some research suggests that, quote, social indicators such as low socioeconomic status, minority status, battering, chronic illness, trauma, drug and alcohol addiction, and poor social environment are negative predecessors of social success. Why is it then that some people overcome adversity and succeed despite the odds? So this study would help to identify the context and factors involved in adult women being able to succeed despite the odds. In context to this study specifically, Hester Prynne is a woman in the place of low status as she is being seen as an ultimate sinner and harlot for her adultery. However, Hester accepts this, wearing her scarlet letter bravely and in turn, overturning the judgment and making it a stance for her own sexual liberation. Dimmesdale, on the other hand, denies his sexual liberation and deteriorates from the inside out as his own subconscious literally eats him alive. Hester succeeds despite the odds because she accepts her truth and sexual desire. And for a woman in the 17th century, and even now, this is a huge step in overcoming the adversity associated with women's liberation. However, there is more to the dynamic of desire than pure sex. There is passion involved as well, especially when there is a youthful female wit among them. Hawthorne also demonstrates that Hester and Dimmesdale shared a true passion for one another. However, their reactions to the colony's scrutiny are quite the opposite of passionate. Hester wears her scarlet letter with her head held high and never names Dimmesdale as her conspirator in the adulterous affair. It is Pearl, the precocious daughter, who can see through the lies and manipulations that the adults use as protection. Pearl effectively represents women's liberation, even through the hindrance of being a child. She denies religion and paternal relationships, arguing that, quote, he, God, did not send me. I have no heavenly father, end quote, and rejecting Puritan government as her society. Although Pearl is a child, she is more insightful than all of the adults surrounding or avoiding her. In describing Pearl, Hawthorne states that, quote, the child could not be made amendable to rules. The result was a being whose elements were perhaps beautiful and brilliant, end quote, suggesting that she is not only an intellectual figure, but a strong and powerful being just the same. Pearl is able to access her mind in a way that is entirely different than Hester and Dimmesdale. Freud would suggest that Pearl prioritizes her subconscious, asking the questions that her mother and father try desperately to hide from, embarrassed of their own subconscious urges. Hawthorne's descriptions of Pearl suggest that she is the most Freudian character in the novel because she is unafraid to psychoanalyze the other characters or even herself. The ability to analyze within and without gives Pearl the power over others and herself because she is physically and mentally connected to being, as in being conscious of the mind, body, and soul simultaneously. Freud suggests that because of her connectivity and curiosity, Pearl is able to challenge her elders, rightfully so, and push them to think about their own conscious and subconscious thoughts and actions rather than shroud themselves in their abundance of protective manipulations like they attempt to do to Pearl. The end of the novel offers a sense of satisfaction to the reader if paired with psychoanalytical and Freudian theories. The so-called crime that Hester and Arthur Dimmesdale committed is not consciously a rebellion against their society. Rather, it is a subconscious liberation fueled by the repression of their psychosexual desires. Freud's theory suggests that in adulthood, Hester and Dimmesdale are in the genital stage, where a reawakening of sexual pleasure is focused on someone outside of one's own family and no longer relates to a maternal or paternal bond. It is necessary for the reader to consider both Freudian theory and the unnatural marriage between Hester and her husband, Roger Chilling. Marriage lacks true love or passion. There is no desire, conscious or subconscious, to produce a child or to consummate the marriage, though this does not always occur and is not always the case, such as in the case of a royal marriage. However, Hester and Dimmesdale found a passion that had been extinguished both by their respective roles as angelic and spiritually enlightened social individuals and by the oppression of the Puritan society. Freud suggests that the subconscious manifests itself. Freud suggests that the subconscious manifests itself in a few ways if it is consistently suppressed. 1, deterioration, 2, depression, or 3, aggravation. The reader can connect the suppression of the subconscious desire and physical and mental deterioration of Arthur Dimmesdale. And similarly, Freud's theory then concludes that Roger Chillingworth's rage and need for revenge is an alternate manifestation of same suppression. Hawthorne suggests that Chillingworth is never a desirable specter to women. Therefore, Freudian analysis can assert that his subconscious sexual desire is continuously under suppression. Chillingworth's subconscious needs to outsource that emotion, and rather than allowing his mind and body to physically deteriorate like Dimmesdale, his outsource is revenge. Because his subconscious need and desire for sexual liberation is unsatisfactory, Chillingworth finds himself deteriorating through his rage, but this is still a reaction to the suppression of his subconscious. What is most important to consider here are the different roles that these male figures, both fictional and non-fictional, have played in women's liberation. Considering the characters, Arthur Dimmesdale is a guilty hypochondriac, unwilling to repent his sins openly, and therefore his mental and physical state deteriorate from his suppression of the subconscious. Similarly, Roger Chillingsworth's rage is so intense that he begins a deterioration from his subconscious reactions as well. However, Hester and Pearl seem to defy the circumstances they are in and come out as the successors in their conservative society, even though Hester is seen as a harlot and Pearl as a bastard. These two women overcome adversity through sexual liberation and intelligence beyond that of their society, elevating them to being the most enlightened characters in the novel. Hawthorne ensures that the women characters, especially those seen as sinners, are the highest regarded in the novel. He, in fact, downplays the physical beauty and intelligence of the other women in the community as inferior to Hester and Pearl, proving that Hawthorne stood for women's liberation, even when using the most extreme examples of a Puritan society. Likewise, Freud was not afraid to speak openly about his controversial studies and agreed that women, as much as men, even more so at times, deserve sexual liberation. What is curious is the amount of time between Hawthorne's work and Freud's study, but how the movement towards women's liberation was still at the forefront of literature and theory in both times. According to Puritan religion, the act that Hester and Dimmesdale commit is a sin because Hester was married to Chillingworth. However, if a passionate bond naturally brings these two characters together, their subconscious minds overtake the conservative rules they are to uphold according to the religion in the colony. Instead, these two give in to the subconscious and allow their sexuality to be shared and to be a source of liberation and rebellion against the society that oppresses them. However, Freud's theory helps to represent the reactions to the actions of sexual liberation for Dimmesdale, or lack thereof for Chillingworth, and how these affect the mind and body. Because Dimmesdale consciously denies his subconscious, his body and mind deteriorate. Because Chillingworth is never able to express his sexual desire, his need for revenge turns this man into a rage-filled monster. However, Hester and Pearl succeed as women in their own world, continuing to wear their armor and sin on the surface of their being, and therefore never being consumed by their subconscious. Freud and Hawthorne were both riveting in their fields, creating theory and content that continues to provoke conversation about suppression, sexual desire, and human nature. These men opened the door for liberation. Hawthorne encourages liberation for women in a patriarchal society, while Freud suggests that sexual liberation is merely subject to the inner workings of the human mind. The works of these two men helped to show issues in women's adversity in two very different time periods, but proved to be key turning points towards women's liberation movements. Hawthorne and Freud create and theorize that there is a certain enlightened state that only women seem to be able to remain steadily on, yet men will crumble under in the face of subconscious controversy. Hester and Pearl prove that women are more than able to liberate themselves, but that agency can be shared by men who support women overcoming adversity. The Scarlet Letter and psychoanalytic theory revolutionized literature and science in a way that is still incredibly relevant to understanding human nature and women's liberation, no matter through a story or through a theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Very much appreciate it. I'm going to put us in a gallery view here so we can all see each other for a conversation here. I only have a couple questions in the chat, and those are from a couple of our organizers. So let me just talk for 30 seconds here and then sort of open it up to the peanut gallery here and see what questions and comments you have, and then I will have recourse to those questions from the chat as well. These are all wonderful papers, and I was struck partly by how different they were, both in terms of your objects of study and in your methodological approaches. That said, there was some some overlap between at least 2 or 3 of your papers in thinking about the psychological workings of memory and desire, and also thinking about structure, right? How structure and trauma go together. I saw that in at least 2, maybe 3 of your papers. So that was just sort of some interesting combinations that I saw there. I can certainly ask questions of everyone, and I have them if needed, but I would rather hear from you than hear from me. So let me open up the floor. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Let us know first to whom your question is directed. If it is to 1, 2, 3, or 4 of the panelists, let us know that, and so that they will know if, when, and how to answer. So what questions or comments do you have? Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, I guess I'll start. First of all, phenomenal presentations, all of you. I want to go back to Dan with this question because you were the first presenter, and it was phenomenal. It made me really rethink Brideshead Revisited. So thank you for that. And you said a term that was really interesting, and I'd like you to kind of commented on it a little bit more, and please forgive me because it feels like it was a while ago when you made the comment. I think you talked about Sebastian's queering of Charles, and I thought that was really interesting. Did you mean that in terms of opening up Charles to a different view, different set of ideologies, or because there's always that question of their relationship? Did they in fact have a relationship, or did they not have a relationship? Or was Charles just really intrigued by the character Sebastian, who opened him up to a whole new realm of possibilities? And then the second part to that question, does Brideshead, the structure and its crumbling and its dismantling and its dehabilitation, if you will, reflect Charles's mental state throughout the novel? If you could comment on that, if you don't mind.
Sure thing. So for the first part of that question, the way I read it is like Sebastian is kind of an influence on Charles and his psyche. As far as like that influence goes, whether they've had a relationship beyond just being like very close with each other is debatable, and I don't have evidence to say one way or the other as far as that goes. But I think in a way that Sebastian really helps to kind of open up Charles's view, or just overall world view. As for the second part of your question and the Brideshead crumbling, I could see that in a way as while the author giving us kind of clues when we're in kind of that present day state of Brideshead slowly being dismantled by time itself, that is very much a reflection on Charles's state of mind at that point, and just his development overall up to that point.
Thank you. What other questions do we have?
It
Go ahead,
just
Tom.
made me think also with Olivia's paper, just sort of that connection of the, for Dan's paper, it's sort of the subconscious and, if the characters are crumbling, what all is going on underneath? Is there things that are being subverted, repressed? Just sort of making that connection as I was listening to this. So I appreciate all the papers. It was great.
And I can even turn that question back on you, Tom, because I think the way you describe that really connects to your story and to your paper as well. I really like the sort of the structural readings you did of how the story structures grief through the way that it messes with time and how it puts us kind of in media res, right? This is the story in a way is not about memory, right? Because you're sort of in the moment. And in a sense, I was wondering if for you that the way that those sort of subsequent nights are described, and I think you talked about how often they don't talk about the object of their grief, right? Even as they're having sort of these good moments. But I'm wondering if that for you in the story and how the structure works to get at how grief actually sort of in some ways does work, right? How we as humans sort of have these little moments that connect us that wrap us back into grief that might be only partially connected to the object of grief itself and things like that. How does a temporary matter for you in the way that it's structured sort of show us that?
And I just really like how she focused on so many the details of life, but without talking about this significant traumatic experience that they just sort of were trying to go on with their lives, even though they clearly weren't. At one point they talk about she comes in from work and it says she drops her satchel onto the chair, and it's just a sense of like, she's lost her child. Like her whole life is just now this physical embodiment. So for me, those are the things that are all around it, yet they aren't able to get at it until this event occurs in their neighborhood.
So until then, the grief is inhering in all those mundane sort of little moments in this sense, right? And we as the reader are in on that in ways that the characters don't realize until they finally have a breakthrough and talk to each other, right? And realize that they have been grieving together in some way.
Right.
Yeah,
So the follow-up question to what Dr. Thompson was just saying to you, Tom, is Lahiri's, and it seems like I've read it briefly, but is Lahiri's attempt at using the sterility of the narration to reinforce the sterility of the mindset, to reinforce the sterility of the lost child? Is that what she's going for, to reinforce the mundanity that's surrounding them, which they don't talk about, but reinforces the idea of the lost child?
Right. I mean, I think that's a real good question. I could see that. I mean, I think that she just keeps them away from where they need to be, which I think is just part of how well she crafts that story, is that she's spending all that time, but not without them really getting to it until the end. So I'm not sure if I answered that, but that I could see that. Yeah, the sterility is clearly in that, because they're not even talking about another baby. They're not talking about, there's nothing. They're not left with a future. They're just there.
Mm-hmm. It's the subject. It's present, but they're not even addressing it. The elephant in the room, let's say.
Yeah,
that's great.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's perfect. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I can move to a question for Joshua, and then we can get one for Olivia as well here to make sure that everyone gets a chance to respond. Joshua, I was struck by your sort of description of these poems as both a yeshiva and surrealist in a sense. That might have struck for me. So my last job before I came to IUP a decade ago was at Yeshiva University in Manhattan, and in some ways it was a surrealist experience for me. But one thing that in the discourse with the students, and so the students would go have the religious classes all morning, and then we'd have the secular classes in the afternoon and into the evening. And I was the assistant soccer coach, and so we'd have soccer practice 9 to 11 p.m. And then go to bed, get up for prayers, and rinse and repeat, right? So in talking with the students there, a concept that really struck with me that came up a lot was so the idea of wrestling with God, right? And I'm coming from Jacob with wrestling with God, and that popped into my head when, especially at the end of your talk, when you're thinking about your work with translation, but also with the Margolin poem, especially that line, and yet, oh God, oh tormentor, I do believe. So I'm wondering if you see that sort of that connection of wrestling with God as part of the poetry writing, and as you described it, reading experience, right? When you embody the I of the person reading the poem. Do you see that as sort of part of that process for writing, reading, translating?
I definitely see the wrestling with God that shows up a lot. And I'll take the Psalms, for example. There's this element of violence, if not like just total like destruction that God is associated with in those poems. And it seems kind of strange at times when you have the speaker, the puny human, addressing the big force that can move mountains and swallow you up, right? That people have this confidence, this they also have some of that authority built in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I like to see that as we do, of course, right? Because that's sort of embedded into the tradition. And with the example with Jacob wrestling with the angel, it's such a visceral one-on-one confrontation. And we don't necessarily see that in the poetry as much as we see it in the narrative sections, especially from Genesis, which you're referring to. We have more confrontations through angels and through visions. Where here in the poems, it's mainly auditory and associative. It's normally expressed through an image or a place or a situation. And I find that interesting that you can still confront the big power of the divine without having to see it in the violent image or in the flames or in the angelic force. You can see it in whatever situation you're going through. And the poets we looked at, they mainly saw it in sort of the places of the cities and the homes and those types of places that they were immediately in, seeing God in sort of the structures that we create, not just in nature.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think you're right. Like, I think it's something, it's baked into the structure of the Psalms in a sense, right? And the sort of the I speaking in sort of direct communication, but then it becomes for all who read it, sort of they're doing the same thing. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Does anyone have any a question? I can do it if need be, but I'd rather you do it. Does anyone have a question for Olivia?
I got a question in the chat from Abdullah, who said for Olivia, is a woman's liberation achieved only by her sexual liberation?
No, definitely not. That paper focused specifically on sexual liberation because that was at the forefront of the plot, but definitely not. I think what I was trying to focus on in that was looking at that as a huge step forward for women's liberation, because that's the one that everyone's like really pushed off by, right? It's okay if a guy does it, but if a girl does it, then it's a problem. It was still okay that Arthur Dimmesdale was involved in the affair because he was the preacher and he was a guy, but it was wrong because Hester was married to somebody else, even though he wasn't there. And they weren't really, I don't know, their relationship was awful, as we know, but if you do know, but no, definitely not. There's many other ways, but that's just kind of an interesting starting point for how long ago that text was written. And then even the distance from the text originally from Hawthorne 200 years later to Freud, and how you can go back and make those connections. I think one of the most interesting points is Pearl as this liberation of intelligence, because that was another thing that women were kind of pushed away from and not given open opportunity to have, to study or to write or to create or to be these little detectives that are like, hey, you're my dad. But she did that. And I think Hawthorne focused on that a lot when he talked about Pearl. Her beauty came from her intelligence and her insight into what was going on around her. And also because she was beautiful like her mother, whereas Hester's beauty came from her physical beauty, but also her willingness to be like, yeah, I did this, put the scarlet letter on my chest, great. You all already know, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Quick follow up to that. So if partly the story that you've told us here about Scarlet Letter is Hester's psychosexual desire sort of leading her to have this affair with Dimmesdale, and then she becomes kind of a hero because she owns it, right? And she eventually, I mean, not immediately, right? She it is tough for her, but eventually the Hawthorne messes with symbols, and so the A becomes a different kind of symbol by the end of the story, and all that. And you did talk a little bit about sort of societal pressures and the sort of the Puritan context a little bit after the adultery happened, in a sense. I think what I wrote down, you said that she's sort of seen as having a low status, right, from the Puritan elders after she is sort of put in prison and forced to wear the Scarlet A. I wonder if you thought a little bit about the before the affair, and even how that might relate to the affair. Hester Prynne was obviously had a low sociopolitical status in the Puritan world before that happened, and Dimmesdale had a high status and had certain power, which he brings to that sexual relationship, which is all unseen by us as the reader, right? We don't know how that worked. We can tell by their interactions afterward that they do care about each other, right? But I'm wondering about the power dynamics that you see for Hester before the sort of offstage pre-book, in the prequel, before the adultery happens, and how those social constraints might have an impact on Prynne's psyche, on the relationship that she has with Dimmesdale, on her sort of interaction with that world, sort of having a little bit of a not a full outsider, because she was of a higher social class, but her gendered status in that society certainly made her sort of seen as having lower status. I wonder how that sort of works into that and fits with the Freudian psychoanalysis that you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think what's interesting maybe to consider, the before thought, is that she was a little bit better off, socioeconomically, not phenomenally. Again, she still had this, arranged kind of marriage with Roger Chillingworth. But her beauty was a huge focus on it as well. Not that really affected anything socially, other than the fact that all of the women in that colony hated her anyways because she was beautiful. And I think that like untouchable thing, because she was so beautiful, she was so unattainable, made Dimmesdale all the more attracted to her specifically. And of course, their power dynamic, especially him as a reverend, their power dynamic is already, very clear, where he has this social standing and she doesn't. But if they were together, if she wasn't married, it would have been okay. But just because she was married, even though her husband was estranged and away from her, it was not. I think maybe what drew the two of them together was that subconscious passion for each other, even though we don't see it until later. It starts somewhere. You don't just, look at somebody and then you're like, yeah, that's the guy. You develop some kind of feeling or emotion towards that person, guy or girl. You develop that emotion, that feeling, and then it propels into that affair that they had. So I think their subconscious drew them together in the first place, and that relationship progressed for the rest of their lives until he deteriorates from his subconscious and she just kind of owns hers. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. We do have one more chat question. This is from Kimberly, and it's for Dan. This question is, so does Julie act more as an evolutionary development of her brother? And Dr. Williamson is giving a thumbs up, so I think he's seconding that question.
Oh God. What does Julia kind of act as an evolutionary element of the brother?
Yeah.
Evolutionary development of her brother.
Yeah, so you kind of
Okay.
were talking about
Cool.
at one point her brother as kind of like a fossil of sorts, and then he kind of disappears from the face of the story, besides from her standpoint. So does that make her an evolutionary development of him then? Because in a lot of ways too, Charles says that he sees a lot of him in Julie as well.
I think so. The way I see it is kind of an evolution of his his infatuation with Charles, but also potentially the infatuation with Brideshead itself. Feel free to correct me at any point, either you or Dr. Williamson, by the way. That you mouthing no at me, but anyway. But yeah, for the simple fact of
No, I won't correct. I don't need to correct.
God, I hope not. But I see it that way as sort of because Julia is kind of representative of that object of desire in like Charles's mind, that he sees that connection,
Dan,
or he has that connection. Yes, Brian.
sorry, Dan, so sorry. Would you say that maybe she's a surrogate for Sebastian? That she's there and she maybe feels the void for a minute? Just the thought.
That's possible. I think so. Like, because I don't want to, because it's also recognizing that Julia is her own sort of character as well, that I don't want to just kind of throw her into that surrogate role. But I wouldn't be surprised if we could potentially say that by being with Julia, Charles is being with Sebastian by extension. And of course, being in that lifestyle of Brideshead.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't he marry her at the end? No.
I don't.
She says no.
I
She
believe
says
they
no.
didn't go through with the marriage.
She rejects him.
Yeah. Like I forgot that. Like I knew there was the rejection. I just couldn't remember that specific details. Like, did they go as far as the marriage, or did they call it off? They called it off.
I am quickly adjusting my computer because my battery is about to run out. While I do that, let me ask, we have about 2 to 3 minutes left, so we probably have time for one more quick question, unless my battery dies and you are all kicked off. Any final question? No pressure.
All right.
just have-
I have to, Dan, I have to ask you, since we're talking about Brideshead, I want your opinion on this. At the end of the novel, is Charles a fully formed human being? Do you feel he's found salvation?
Well, his encounter with the church at Brideshead would suggest maybe, at least in Charles's mind, he's redeemed himself. As for us, the readers, I'll leave that open to interpretation. Yes, I'm taking the cheap way out.
Oh, I can't believe you're taking that out. Great answer. Perfect answer.
Well, I hope as Dr. Thompson
ahead, Mike.
is now, Dr. Thompson's now an honorary member of Josh's Surrealist Yeshiva. I hope more people can join. I'm sure anybody who wants to learn Yiddish or begin learning a language or open things up, I think Josh and I would be willing to, glad to work with anybody. And I had just a quick final question for Josh, taking a lot of risks there with your presentation, which I really appreciated. So it's a question kind of for everybody else. What's it like hearing this poetry in another language, seeing the translations, and being presented with something that certainly might seem at first to be quite foreign, but then, as Dr. Thompson was commenting, became much less so. Just curious if anybody wants to weigh in on that as audience members.
I'll weigh in. I do think it's any kind of translation work. I think it automatically brings, like Josh was saying, it brings that own gravitas to it, and I think it was. I love that he did that in his presentation. I like that you're tackling it to the extent that you did. So I dealt with translations in the past. I know how much that there's, especially I like how you were dealing with the psalm there and how you use the name of Lord. Like it's so often in the Bible we had just Lord written throughout, but you chose the one that was used there and said that instead when you during your presentation. I really appreciate that and how you use those elements and grapple with them, and to just like, well, some people just like translate and allow it to speak as that, but you still grapple with the translation after you translate. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
That's sort of one of the playful elements that's embedded in the original Hebrew that you necessarily can't translate into English all the time. Since the word for God is typically unvocalized, you can say it however you want. It's up to you, really, how you'd like to address it. There's one more comment about translation. The translation of Yiddish Street, I credited as my own translation, but I have to be honest that I worked on it with several other Yiddish students over the winter, and I may not have ever come across that poem without somebody else selecting it for me. So that sort of extends the co-creative process behind translation some.
Yeah, I think shared reading, right, is also an act of creation in a sense, right? We have just within this panel, we've had interpretive communities who have all read and debated Brideshead, right, and have strong opinions about that. There are, anytime you go to a panel, there's going to be text that you know and text that you don't know, and sort of methodologies that you know and methodologies that you don't know or wish you didn't know, and that's all fine, and that's why it's good to sort of not just share your work, but also go and listen to and engage with other people who are sharing their work. So so thank you all for coming to either share your work and or listen to other people share their work and to engage with it. So I appreciate it. Check your the schedule for tomorrow. It's all in the why am I forgetting the word for the
program?
Program. It's called a program. Yes. This is what happens to me after an hour and a half of Zoom. So thank you all for very much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Really quick.
Give yourselves and each other a round of hands.
Woo! Thank you, panelists. Our next panel, third panel tomorrow is at 9 a.m. Learning how to rise out of the ashes. And then our second one is at 10:45, using fantasy to overcome adversity. And one last note, we will be having a get together after the conference is over, 1:30 at Levity. And for all those that arrive, I am buying the first round of drinks. So please come out, enjoy. Tom's like, yeah, I'm there.
Use the ego budget.
So it's going to be fun.
Well, we also have for those people who can't make it to the in-person one, who aren't in town, we will also, right after our final panel, we have a virtual reception happening for the first half hour. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you join us there as well.
I'm allowed to bring my own booze to that.
Thank you.
Or